Chapter 12. What do our hearts treasure? Old age is a special problem for me because I've never been able to shed the mental image I have of myself, a lad of about 19. There's a picture of E.B. White and his wife, E.B. White and his dog. As time went on, Andy wrote less. The Whites spent some time in Florida, but living in Maine was anything but retirement for Andy and Catherine. In the spring, they planted gardens and tended to lambs, geese, chickens, and their broods. In late summer, they cut firewood and hayed the fields. In the fall, they stored ripened pumpkins and stacked firewood for the winter. And then it was spring again, and there were newly hatched chicks to keep warm. And beyond the field, sloping to Allen Cove, was Andy's small sloop Fern. He wrote, "When I want some fun, I don't write, I go sailing." And he named his boat Fern. There's his son, all grown up. Joel now lived nearby with his own family. Andy once wrote that Joel's boat Flounder had launched 1,000 ships. Joel had become a naval architect and ran a boatyard, designing and building traditional wooden boats. He built boats with the same verve Andy brought to writing. That verve is like enthusiasm. Joel designed and built his dad's 20-foot sloop that he named Martha, after Andy's granddaughter, and he rigged it so Andy could sail it alone. Remember Andy as E.B. White. In 1977, after a series of illnesses, Catherine died of heart failure. That's his wife. That's sad. At her service, the family read Andy's poem, Natural History. Andy did not go. He was too distraught. That means sad. Later, Andy planted an oak tree at her gravesite. He wrote a friend, "I have lost the one thing that seemed to make any sense in my life, and I feel like a child lost at Coney Island." Life did go on. He spent his time doing chores around the barn, sailing, and playing with his grandchildren. Andy and the New Yorker editor, Dorothy Lebrano Guth, finished a project that he and Catherine had begun, editing the tens of thousands of letters he had written over his lifetime for a new book, Letters of E.B. White. The collection was as close to an autobiography as Andy would get. An autobiography is the story of your own life, so those letters are telling the story of his life. In time, Andy gave up sailing, but not boating. For his 81st birthday, he borrowed a canoe and went back to Belgrade Lakes. He wrote, "The trip was a success. Weather smiled, and the canoe, which leaked only slightly, could have been called Summer Memories." When he returned home, he bought himself an Old Town canoe, just like the one his dad had given him for his 11th birthday. He later wrote to a friend, "The year is only a few days old, but I am already in my thoughts careening towards summer and fall, awaiting the day when I can boost my canoe on top of the car and set out for the lake." And here's some from his letters. "I'll be 85 in July. Am still riding a bike, but have lost the sight in one eye, along with a lot of other losses. Last fall, I was tooling along on my 3-speed Raleigh," that's a type of bike, "when a coyote emerged from the woods and followed me. I don't think he was anything but curious, but it was kind of spooky to have a wild animal tailing me. It was probably his first octogenarian on wheels, and he just wanted to get a good look at it." An octogenarian is someone who's between the ages of 80 and 89, so someone in their 80s. So he thinks the animal was curious to see such an old person riding a bike that he followed him. Because his eyesight was failing, Andy resigned from writing. The news breaks for the New Yorker in 1982. He had written more than 30,000. Andy thanked William Shawn and the magazine for keeping him gainfully employed for such a long period of time. One day, after Andy went canoeing, he stumbled and hit his head. Later on, he complained he wasn't feeling right. He was never quite himself again. Doctors diagnosed him with dementia. Eventually, Andy was confined to bed with around-the-clock help. During the last year of his life, Joel visited every day. In his memoir, Let Me Finish, Andy's stepson Roger writes, "Joel told me that in the long year, He'd read aloud to his father often and discovered that he enjoyed listening to his own writings, though he wasn't always clear about who the author was. Sometimes he'd raise a hand and impatiently wave a passage away. Not good enough. Other evenings he'd listen to the end, almost at rest, and then he'd ask again who had written these words. "You did, Dad," Joe said. Then a pause, and Andy said, "Well, not bad." So when you get dementia, a lot of times you forget, you lose your memory. So he forgot that he wrote the book. So his son is reading him out loud one of his own books, like Charlotte's Web. And sometimes he'd be like, skip that part, that's not good. And then other parts he'd say, like, "Who wrote this again?" "You did, Dad." And then he'd say, "Well, not bad." Here he is on the swing in the barn. This is just like the scene in Charlotte's Web. Okay, chapter 13. This is the last chapter. Sentences we hated to come to an end. All that I hope to say in books, all that I ever hope to say, is that I love the world. I guess you can find that in there if you dig around. E.B. White died on October 1st, 1985, at the age of 86. He left instructions for his home to be sold. He did not want his farm turned into a museum. Ever since his childhood vow to never go up on stage again, Andy had avoided public and private events, town meetings, weddings, graduations. So at his memorial service, Roger Angell told the congregation, "If Andy White could be with us today, he would not be with us today." Because he didn't like to go to those kinds of things. His obituary, that's when they write up about the story of your life. And the New Yorker read in part, "White had abundantly the most precious and the least learnable of writerly gifts, the gift of inspiring affection in the reader." Whether he was working on a poem, a cartoon caption, an essay, or a children's book, E.B. White felt it was the writer's obligation, that's like a job, to transmit as best he can his love of life, his appreciation of the world. So we really get that from all his love of animals and nature. Even though White lived much of his life on a farm in Maine, remote from the clatter of publicity and celebrity, fame overtook him, fortunately leaving him untouched. So he did become really famous, but it didn't change him. His connections with nature were intimate and ardent. He loved his farm animals, his neighbors, his family, his words. E.B. White never believed that writers were celebrities. He wrote that when he was a child, an author was a mythical being. The book was the thing, not the man behind the book. He did not seek literary approval and never considered himself a great reader. He preferred reading farm journals and boating magazines. Much of what he wrote was not for children, yet many considered Charlotte's Web not only White's magnum opus, that's like his biggest project of his life, but one of the best children's books ever written. Did E.B. White ever wish he'd written a masterpiece for adults? His stepson said the thought would not have occurred to him. Andy once said, "Anyone who writes down to children is simply wasting his time. You have to write up, not down." That means, like, don't try to make it easier because you're writing for children. You have to make it harder. Children are demanding. They are the most attentive, curious, eager, observant, sensitive, quick, and generally congenial readers on earth. Children are game for anything. I throw them hard words and they backhand them over the net. In his essays, E.B. White wrote about the environment, racism, world government, and other complex topics with keen wit. He maintained he wrote by ear for an audience of one. In reviewing essays of E.B. White, somebody described his words as music. The man knows all the tunes, all the limited, lovely music that a plain English sentence can play. So he just gets compliment. He's not loud or obvious fun, but it contained enturning fun. There were a few critics along the way, and not just young readers wanting to know whether Stuart Little ever found Margalo. "I don't like the way it ends. It makes me sad," one reader wrote. Criticism in 1947 from the New York Herald during the McCarthy era, when E.B. White fiercely opposed the blacklisting of Americans who refused to answer questions about their loyalty, political beliefs. White shot back to the newspaper editors, I'm a member of a party of one. I hold that it would be improper for any committee or any employer to examine my conscience. It's not a crime to believe anything at all in America. White believe profoundly in freedom. To be free in a planetary sense is to feel you belong to the earth. To be free in a social sense is to feel at home in a democratic framework. So that's all talking about like our policies in America. Like you can have your own opinion. You don't have to listen to one person's opinion. That's so important, he's saying. And to be free as a writer meant he was able to write as he pleased, to get down on paper a little capsule of truth. The truth came out in simple, clear sentences, writing that William Shawn described as utterly beautiful. He was ageless, and his writing was timeless. And this is true because his books are classics. Like, kids have been reading those for so long, and they're, no matter what year it is or what's happening in the world, they still are so good. And there's something else he wrote in his letters. Hang on to your hat, hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. And there's a picture from his journal. So he loved the world, he loved nature, he loved animals. And then this is from the author who wrote the book, Melissa Sweet. And she just says she learned so much about him, and she enjoyed writing this book. There's pictures of him. At the end. And here's a timeline of his life. That's his wife when she was little. The White family and the lake. That's New York Public Library. There's a copy of the cover of the New Yorker, which he wrote for the New Yorker. There he is with his wife. There's Stuart Little. His dog. Oh, I had a dachshund. There he is here. He got an award. And then he wrote Charlotte's Web. He got an award from a senator. Then he wrote Trumpeter of the Swan. And that's the end of the story. So I will come back and read the chapters that have to do with Charlotte's Web at the very end. But I wanted you guys to hear these first. Okay, take care.